All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for an exciting new webinar about lean rapid process improvement in the nonprofit and local government workplaces. My name is Liza Dodoli, and I'm the interim program manager for the Executive Master of Public Administration program and program assistant for the Nonprofit Institute here at Portland State University. Just want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and audience members are muted and your video has been disabled. If you have questions for us, please put them in the question and answer box. I will go over our Q&A process in more detail soon. Before we get started, I'd like us to take a moment to acknowledge that what we now call Portland, Oregon and Multnomah County are the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Cowlitz bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other family bands and tribes who made and continue to make their homes along the Columbia and Willamette River. Today, people from these bands have become part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, as well as the Chinook Nation and Cowlitz Nation in Washington State. Because of forced displacement and U.S. federal government relocation policies, Portland has the 9th largest Native American population in the United States. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In acknowledging these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. The Hatfield School is the academic home of the Institute of Tribal Government and Certificate of Tribal Relations, which is working in ongoing partnership with our sovereign tribal nations. I invite you to engage in active education and reflection of the lands you reside upon. To learn more about the lands you live on, I encourage you to visit the website nativeland.ca. Today's webinar has been organized by the Nonprofit Institute, a branch of the Center for Public Service at Portland State University. Our mission is to support the Oregon nonprofit sector so that it can fulfill its promise of bringing people together to build a more just, inclusive, and sustainable society. We believe that nonprofits are essential, that equity and social justice are at the center of nonprofit work, that knowledge should be shared across boundaries, and that collaboration makes our work better and more effective. We strive to produce trainings and workshops that reflect our mission, and today's webinar is one of our newest offerings. Our presenter today is Sheilah Paddy O'Brien. Paddy is a nickname because her Irish father said, well, she is born on St. Patrick's Day and therefore she is a Paddy. Paddy holds a Master in Public Administration from Cornell University, is a Lean Sigma 6 Green Belt and OMPA. Paddy is the author of 2 books about Lean, Lean for the Nonprofit, What You Don't Know Can Cost You, and Facilitating Rapid Process Improvement Workshops, a self-study guide for the Lean leader. A state manager once said that Paddy is possibly the first person to introduce process improvement and Lean into state government. Paddy brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to her work and has been helping organizations improve the way they do their work for the last 17 years. She has conducted over 30 improvement workshops and developed over 15 classroom trainings. Before Paddy starts her presentation, I'd like to give a short overview of how the presentation and question and answer process will go. Paddy will do her entire presentation, and then we will take questions at the end. If you would like to ask a question during the question and answer portion of our presentation, please type your question in the Q&A box, which you can access via the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you see that someone else has already asked the same question, or there is a particular question that you would like to see answered, you may upvote it. The most popular questions will go to the top of our queue. You may enter your question at any point during the presentation, but we will not answer them until the end. We are looking forward to answering your questions and starting a discussion. Paddy has prepared a great take-home document for you to practice and apply some of today's learnings. I'll drop a link in the chat and you can download that at your convenience. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it off to Paddy, who will introduce you to Lean Rapid Process Improvement for nonprofits and local government.
Well, thank you, Liza. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time, especially during your lunch hour, to come and listen to this webinar. As you can imagine, I have a strong belief that Lean can help governments and nonprofit organizations. Here's our agenda for today. What is Lean? Where did it come from? How does it work? And of course, show me. So I have many examples to share with you. But first of all, let's get the definition of lean out of the way. Lean is not an acronym. It is a management production system that was popularized by Toyota in Japan because they wanted to make their cars come out of the assembly lines faster. And lean was a way to streamline. But before I get into any more of that, I want to tell you a story. This is a story about a monument in Washington, D.C. The National Park Service was very concerned because the monument was deteriorating. So the question was asked, why is it deteriorating? Well, because they're using harsh chemicals to clean it. And another question, why are they using harsh chemicals? Well, because there were a lot of bird droppings. Oh my, why are there a lot of bird droppings? Well, there are a lot of bird droppings because there's a whole population of spiders that are a food source for the birds. And why is there a whole population of spiders? Well, it's because there are a lot of insects that they feed on that come into the monument. And the insects show up at dusk. And why do the insects come to the monument? Because the monument is illuminated and they are attracted to the light. This is just one of the tools we use in Lean to get at what we call the root cause. And very simply, this is the 5 why tools. Now, next, if we go on and let me expand just a little bit, because, you know, we have a lot of questions about, is this a new flavor of the month? And I, like you, asked the question. You know, it was popularized by Toyota, but this was all built on many historical management innovations. You know, the assembly line, Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, Taylor's work standards, and a way of restocking shelves when shelves were emptied. All of these concepts and tools were used by Toyota to streamline their processes. Next, we may ask, okay, great, how does Lean work? Well, Lean has many different methods and tools, but one of the things that I want to talk about is what I call the vehicle for implementing Lean. And it's called a Rapid Process Improvement Workshop. This is a workshop actually made up of a team and facilitators. Who's on the team? The people who know the work, the staff. It's believed that they have a frontline view of the problems, but have never been given the forum or tools and guidance about how to solve them. Well, you ask, why is it called Rapid? Well, it's called Rapid because instead of having 6-month feasibility studies where people meet, a team comes together during a week, 3 to 5 days. And under that time, they decide, they understand the problem, they collect data, get at the root cause, use their tools, and come up with suggestions for improvement. You've heard of W.E. Deming. He was an engineer who was an expert in quality, and he taught the Japanese as well. What he said is, if only management knew what waste is and what it does to a process, they would reduce it and increase their productivity. Next. So one of the tools that the RPI team is taught and they first use is called a flow chart or a process map. This is what one looks like. It's important to do this because the team wants to know what the problem is first. We want to understand it. We want to see how it's laid out now. So they develop a flow chart. For those of you who are not familiar with this, think about in English classes many, many years ago when we had to diagram sentences. This flow chart moves from left to right. Starts with decide the purpose, goes through all the steps, and finally at the end, it distributes the notification. The problem with processes, and let me just reiterate that here, is that we don't know how to think in terms of them. And you know why? Because all of us do our work so automatically that when we stop and are told that there's a structure to it, and especially if you're working on an RPI team, we are forced to think about our work in a different way. And you know what? When you can see your work and measure your work and time your work, you can improve your work. Right now, right now, I want to insert this quote for you. And next, this is a quote that can apply to all organizations, but I thought it was very succinct. You can really read it yourselves, so I'm not going to read it all to you. But it's from the Duran Institute. Many of you may have heard of them. They're a renowned quality institution, and they teach a lot of courses and give a lot of certifications. And basically it says, you know, for a nonprofit, money comes in from donors, external customers, and money goes out, and it goes out a lot because of cash leaks in the process. And when you plug those leaks, you recoup the money that was spent on the waste, and you get to keep it and reinvest. I'll just give you a chance to think about that. Next, I want to show you a very, very interesting and important concept that I teach the team. And so I pass this along to you. You know, there is a lot of abstract and lingo used in new bodies of work. And one of them is waste, and one of them is flow. You know, I had to go through a learning process myself to say, you give me a list of waste, but I can't see them in context. What am I supposed to do with them? They sort of just hang in the air. And then I thought of pruning a tree. That's what waste is, and what you do with it. You figure out how to take the dead wood out. An arborist does that regularly, and they do it because they see there's a lot of overgrowth. And when there's that, there's no chance for new growth. And let's look at the term flow or smooth. As you looked at some of the flow charts, we didn't point out, but there's times in between the steps. And during these times you investigate, and you want to find out why there's delays. So a flow diagram or flow chart or making the flow run smoothly reminds me of a roundabout. There's no more four-way stops. It's a roundabout. And so I want to present with you next a very common problem that we have seen. Here is a flow chart of your favorite coffee place. And don't be deterred by reading it. It basically says a customer comes in and makes an order, and then there's a whole bunch of steps, and then the customer receives the drink. However, this takes a certain amount of time to do. And in counting the steps, there were 30 steps to doing this. An RPI team would look at this, and next they would do their work. They would do a step-by-step analysis, as you see on the next slide. They would look at each step and say, wow, does this have value? Does it need to stay in the process? Is this waste? Can it be eliminated? Oh my goodness. And there are necessary steps there because of laws or regulations. So the team went through all of this. And as you can imagine, the flow chart changed significantly. One of the things I want to point out is on this, you see that diamond? That diamond is a decision. And many times when we think about our workflows, we forget about that time and that step where we have to make a decision that also has a yes answer or a no answer, which lead to different parts of the process. So let's look next at the after map of the coffee place. Pretty reduced, isn't it? Customer orders a coffee, customer receives the drink. Now we are down to 18 steps. You could see in color what's of value. Some are necessary, still got a little waste in there, but a great improvement from when we first looked at this process. So now I think it's important for me to show you some real life case studies. Next, specifically in government. Let me share with you that state government doesn't make cars, but they make a lot of things. They make what I call health cards. Do you think that we could do a rapid process improvement on the processing and delivery of a health card? So the team decided to pull together their own RPI team, the staff, and got the approval of the manager, and they conducted their work. And of course, the first thing that they did, as you know by now, is they got to know the problem. And they flow charted, and they collected data. And they also collected this data. But before I go into this, I want to tell you what the process looks like. A citizen who thinks they are eligible for the OHP plan get an application from a variety of places around the state or Portland. And those applications are sent into a processing center, which is usually a square block. And the sole purpose of this processing center is to take that application and eventually figure out, by looking at data and doing background checks and looking at income, to see whether or not the applicant is eligible for the Oregon Health Plan. And if they are, they give them and send them an Oregon Health Plan card. But one of the first things that the RPI team wanted to know was, my goodness, what is the volume of work that comes into this place? And how many different kinds of work do they do? So you can see these numbers for yourself. One of the things I want to point out, this is just for the first quarter, is that hearings are expensive, but hearings are a tool for an applicant if they wish to argue the decision made on their application. And it goes to a particular hearing process, and there are hearings officers who hear it. And the other thing I want to point out is, I believe this day 42, I think it's a little higher, as we'll see in the next slide, but processing days, they are 40 plus days out from the time an application comes in till they get it out the door and in the hands as a health card for the applicant. And more critical is, as you can see, trying to catch up. Organizations, you know what they do? They just give a lot of overtime. And 869 hours represents a big, big cost. So let me move on and show you what happened next. You can ask yourself, well, what happened at the processing center? Well, on the left is a very simple picture of what a process is. It's pretty straightforward. Client submits something, it goes through the process, and it comes out, and they get what they expected, and they got it on time. On the right, this is what happens when a process morphs. It adds more steps over the years. This is what happened at the Oregon Health Plan. Every legislature, every 2 years, added another population that could access healthcare. So they had to add more steps to the process. But the problem was All these nooks and crannies were bottlenecks in the process, and nobody had gone back to look at this, to say, peel the layers of the onion, to take out what is unnecessary to do now. So next, on the first thing that a team does besides a flow chart is they actually go to where the work is being done. They do a physical tour of how the process flows. In this case, they started at the mailroom and they just observed. They looked at this, they made a lot of notes, and they made notes about this mailroom. And then they went on to the other workstations that the application goes through. They went through barcoding, they went through imaging, and finally they went through eligibility. So they got to the end of the process and they had a pretty good idea of things that they wanted to add or look at that were displayed in their flow chart. So they did their work, collected data, performed experiments, and then came back and recommended a number of improvements. And next, once they finished, here comes the data that shows the improvements. They started out at, well, I said 42, but 45 days, and they got it down to 5 days. There was an 88% reduction. The hearings requests were on 191 days down to 131. And as you can see, 40 minutes to 18, reduced 50%, and absolutely important, there were no more overtime hours. Some of you may ask, okay, how does this cost out? Well, just remember that processes can be cost out before improvements and after improvements. And there's a lot of costs that go into a process. You can think about it: overhead, personnel, benefits, time, materials, training, etc. So we calculated that the total cost for the current process was $382,500. And we looked at the current process and we subtracted that. And out of moving all the waste, the Oregon Health Plan was able to come up with savings of $261,300 that they reinvested. Now, after this government example, I want to move into nonprofits. Next, I want to show you this headline. Although a few years ago, it still holds true today that social services are a very important part of our commerce. And we all know from way back in the recession of 2008, money dried up. Foundations were pulling in their money, churches couldn't give as much anymore, and nonprofits were left to their own devices to balance their budget. So what many executive directors did was they said, I have to balance my budget. I don't have any money to hire consultants or staff to help me, so I'm going to have to cut some line items. And unfortunately, some of those line items affected what I call the mission critical programs. Oh my. And they didn't know that there was another alternative to cutting their budgets. But next, we will see a zoo who used lean improvements. Let me tell you a little background about this zoo. The staff was very dedicated, and they had put in a request for a future project. They wanted to build a koala bear exhibit. They thought that it would be a boon and raise revenue for the zoo. But unfortunately, when budget time came and the budget was finally improved, that line item got cut. But the team, the zoo staff, wasn't deterred because they had read about the local hospital who was using lean concepts and tools. So they approached the director and got some lean training, and they were given permission to form a rapid process improvement workshop to look at the zoo and see where improvements could be made. And of course, the executive director approved the workshop as long as he said it didn't cost any money. And next, this is what the first thing the RPI team did. They listed their processes. Pretty simple, huh? They'd never done this before. Ticket sales, cleaning of exhibits, paying the employees, maintaining the grounds, and monitoring the health of the animals. How do they go about and focus in on where they're going to do their improvement work? Well, I'll tell you, the customer spoke. They heard that employees were very, very concerned about a lot of mistakes that showed up monthly on their pay stubs. So the team next decided to look at the zoo payroll process. And here you can see it. They mapped it. They looked at it. And they found many, many areas of improvement. And the best thing they wanted to do was make sure that the errors weren't necessarily just plain human errors, or was it systems caused errors? And that was really important. So they got at the root causes and they came up with a lot of improvements. And next, they did another improvement on the zoo grounds. As again with customers, the executive director had sent out a customer survey because he saw a dip in some of the attendance. So he sent out a survey, and what he got back was a lot of complaints from mothers of young children who said, "I will never come to the zoo again. My children get so tired walking from exhibit to exhibit that we leave halfway through and don't even get our money's worth, and I'm not coming back." So again, this was startling because it would be a decrease in revenue. So the RPI team went to work, got a map and a blueprint of the grounds. They identified what were the popular kid-centric exhibits, and they got permission to move them all together. And they moved all of them together, but moved them up closer to the front gate. And so the problem was solved. By the way, they got to build the koala bear exhibit, I think, and it was so popular that people came and the revenue of the zoo was raised on the whole. Now, next, let's go back to another government example. As you know, I was doing some work in the Department of Human Services, and one of the things, one of the responsibilities of this department is the assurance of child welfare. There's such a process called the streamlining the case transfer process. Basically, the problem was, along the flow of this process, parents and other caregivers would call the field office trying to find out who the caseworker was for their particular case. And they never could find out. There was such duplication and confusion among the staff that it caused problems in the smooth flow of this process. So next, let me show you not necessarily a flow chart, but just a drawing of the case transfer process. If child welfare is called, there's 48 hours, to remove the child from the home and a court appearance. Then there are steps to help the parent and the child. There could be there could be reunification, going into foster care, or eventually adoption. Now, it's really important that there is a facet in this work that may not affect all of your organizations. This work is terribly emotional for people, and they are very dedicated to it. So can you imagine some of the problems in resisting any recommendations for change? One of the things that I want to, if you want to point out with the arrows, is that there are two different casework teams who work on this process. The Child Protective Services team comes in one place, and then the ongoing case management team comes in another place. And this is the cause of the problem. They weren't talking to each other. Both representatives of these casework teams sat on the RPI work team. But there was a problem. And this is interesting as a people problem when you are working with these teams. I got a lot of stares, crossed arms as I was trying to facilitate the team. I had to move them every day from certain steps to certain steps. They were stuck. I didn't know what to do until I finally figured out that they weren't talking to each other. And if they weren't talking to each other, there was no way we could move on the improvement work. So I came up with an idea. Next, I picked one person from one casework team and another person from another casework team. And I said, we have a problem. You think you can handle this case better than they do. And you think you can handle this case better than they do. And remember, the emotion involved really comes down, who can take care of the child better, one team or the other? So I reached back into 60 minutes. Remember, point counterpoint. I asked them to present their case to each other in front of the whole team and debate and go at it. And of course, it was comical, but it was very truth-telling. They were able to communicate after this. And you can see next that one of the things that they did was they looked at the forms in this particular process. We forget about things like forms, how much they affect the smooth flow of a process. I asked them to get all the forms that they used in the process, come back and paste them up to the flow chart. There were 39 forms. I was shocked. But then I realized a lot of the forms were handmade. And why is that? Because a lot of the official forms that came from central office didn't serve the needs of the caseworkers. So God bless them. They decided to do a workaround. So they got together as a team and they collaborated and they took out duplication. And they were able to reduce the forms from 39 down to 8, a significant improvement that would affect the time of the process. So how are we doing on time? Okay, so I think what I'll do is go on to this next hospital example. I participated in an RPI at this hospital, and the subject was surgical trays and how do you what would we say? How do you supply the tray? How do you find the right tools, etc.? Surgical trays are used, of course, in the operating room when the surgeon asks for a particular tool and it's handed to him. Well, the problem is that surgeons develop a list of tools for their particular procedure, but they don't give it to the nurse until the last minute right before the surgery. So there's a lot of rushing going around, and there were mistakes. So what happened in this case, an RPI team got together, and next, this is some of the things that they did. Of course, they collected data, they formed their team, they found the root cause, they had solutions, they did some improvements on setups, standardizations, and they made a new flow diagram and new procedures. And next, I want to show you a new tool that they use besides a flow chart. I want you to become familiar with this. This is called a Cypoc diagram. It's really sort of a macro view of the process. There's a supplier and input. There's certain tasks, process. There's an output and a customer. So this helps very simply for the nurses to look at this. They saw who was the customer in each one of these tasks. And of course, the patient was the ultimate customer. So the team got together with the nurses and they came up with a solution. I went to all the doctors and they said, can we agree on a standard list of tools that you use in all the surgeries so that we can do a pre-setup early on in preparation for your surgery. And then you can give us your customized list at the last minute. And indeed, this solved a lot of the problems. Let me go on next to one last example. It's a different kind, but this has to do with the Archives Agency for the state of Oregon. As you could see, they have a rather large warehouse, another block, a square block warehouse. It's located in Salem. And what happens is there are laws that say state agencies have to retain certain records for a certain number of years. They are packed in boxes and sent, either picked up or delivered, to this warehouse. And they come all the time. The staff doesn't know when they're going to get them, and they come from all over Portland. So the staff has to go through, input them into the database, put the boxes on a forklift, take them around the warehouse, and file them, divide them, and put them on large shelves that are marked. But there's another kink in this process. There are requests from particularly lawyers who are in court cases that are requesting to retrieve certain files. So there are requests to come in that engage the warehouse workers to go into the warehouse, find the right box, and retrieve the file, and then send it out to the requester. Okay, very simply, those of you who may have loading docks or seen them, their loading docks were a mess. So one of the things that we did was we helped them put tape on the loading dock. So we had an in lane and then we had an out lane, and that helped organize somewhat. The other thing we observed is that warehouse workers went all over the warehouse to look for tools, especially box cutters. There was a lot of time expended in that looking. The manager decided to buy more tools, and then all over the warehouse, there were set up what's called tool stations. So a worker could retrieve a tool from there and put it back. Another simple lean concept. And now, next, I am coming to the end of this before we get to your questions. I know it's a lot, but I want to share with you some of the challenges and learnings about this work. There's a big picture when you are analyzing a process. And here again, we talk about systems and process thinking. The shapes at the bottom of the chart are the specific process that an RPI team works on. And that process came out of the big eligibility determination process, which was part of the whole application for health plans, and which was all part of the health business systems, licensing providers, application, admitting clinics, hospitals, and systems. If the bottom is not connected to the top, then the people who are making the improvements there will be making them for themselves. They will become little isolated islands of excellence that cannot be replicated throughout the whole agency. And really, that's the purpose of doing an RPI, to see if other parts of the organization can replicate it. The next thing I want to show you is, I talked to you about how abstract certain concepts were. Well, I discovered that sometimes when explaining flow, it's important to show the opposite. This clicked with the team when I said, this isn't flow. And they said, oh, I get it now. It's really hard to conceptualize. So feel creative in trying to explain what you're trying to say. Another slide is probably very common to a lot of you. This happened to me a lot. Here's a typical outreach worker. When I approached him about lean, he said, lean, what's that? I don't think that can be of use to me. Look it, I deal with people. I do wraparound services. I am paid to think, and you can't time thinking. So I will leave you with that problem and tell you the answer, what I did later on. The other next challenge I wanted to share with you is, again, understanding processes. If you can answer these 3 questions, which I am giving you the whole 25 questions in the handout, you are on your way to internalizing process. It's hard, but it's very necessary if we are going to do lean improvement work. And finally, next, here is the whole enchilada in one slide. So I hope it's helpful. Lean. If faced with no new money, no new staff, no new capital, you can use your own staff to do a rapid process improvement workshop. You have to remember that you're focusing on the process, and the process serves the customer. If the customer is not satisfied with what they're getting from you, 1, they could complain to your legislature, your board of directors, or take their donations somewhere else. And what's involved in the RPI is understanding what the process is as it is, taking out the waste, smoothly flow, and of course, standardizing the improved process, and then making sure and coming back and make sure that the sustainment of the improvement holds. And we do that by comparing before measures and after measures. So that's the end of my presentation. And next, I want to say thank you very much. I knew it was a lot. I think I probably went through things quickly, but let's go to questions.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Paddy, that was a great presentation. Let's get started with our Q&A. First up, we have, how do we ensure that lean results in improvements in equity? I struggle with balancing efficiency and productivity with staff satisfaction and reducing burnout.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a really good one. So I think that speaks to the last slide, one of the slides I showed about the outreach worker. You know, we have to reach everyone who may want to have help in improving their own processes. So I did some research about social work burnout. And guess what? There's a lot of things about their work that can be identified as a process that takes away so much time from their client to client engagement. And that's what they really want to do. So we looked at all those, that research, and their complaints were, I had to chase down a supervisor to get a signature. There were too many forms to fill out. I had to cover myself. I don't have time to meet with my clients. Well, all of these things are things that can be drawn out and improved. We have to, let me just say this. I think understanding the amount of crisis management that we have in our workplaces is really important. And if we stopped, we could probably take some of the time that we spend on crisis and attend to improvement. But of course, in crisis management, improvement gets shoved out. I hope that answers. If not, send me an email or a comment, please. Anything else?
Sorry, I was muted. Looks like we have another one here. How do you get buy-in from an organization to approach their systems this way?
Well, you know, people say you need leadership and from the top and approval, but in the one book that I wrote about lean for the nonprofit, it was written for the executive director who asked the same question. You know, I don't know what I'm getting into if I invite lean into my organization. So how do you make sure that, one, you're ready for lean? And there are suggestions in the book for that. But more importantly, if you wanted to do an improvement project, pick something that's easy and that benefits a lot of people. If you'll notice in the zoo example, they picked the payroll process. That affected everybody. And so you had a win that you could talk about and say, look, there are many people who are concerned about the length of time or the cost of doing an RPI. And let me remind you that you're using your own staff when you do an RPI workshop. So there's not a lot of cost. And this workshop is made up of staff people who do come up with improvements, but in a very short amount of time that they think are doable. So once you get some of those and people can see that things are done, improved, you can talk about other projects. So back to my first statement, yes, leadership from the top is important, but also from the bottom, go for it and show them.
Okay, looks like we have another question. And it is, what was your response to the person working with people, not processes? Or more broadly, where the service is very customized or not recurring?
Well, let me just say, first of all, I wouldn't say that I don't mean to criticize, but I wouldn't say that customized and recurring are mutually exclusive, okay? You can have, those may be one-time tasks as opposed to a repeatable process, if I understand you. And, you know, you can't really do improvements on that. They just are, because when we think about processes, they are routine and they are repeatable, but sometimes we don't even see them. What was the rest of the question? Sorry, Liza.
That's all right. I'll just read it again.
Okay.
What was your response to the person working with people, not processes, or more broadly, where the service is customized or not recurring?
Well, I'll tell you, these people are it's very emotional work. And I must say that when you're a facilitator, there are a lot of different cultures in an organization. And I use the old saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So unless you understand the culture, the language of the people you're working with and what their concerns are first, they're not going to listen to you. But for the caseworker, the complaints I often heard were, I don't have time. I'm trained. There's a requirement for me to have FaceTime 30 hours with my clients. I can't do it. I'm busy writing reports. So I listen to them and I say, you know, those writing reports, that's a process that we can get rid of or improve so that you can do your other work. I hope that answers it, but that's how I answered it. I did the research on burnout.
Thanks, Patty. And everyone, we have some room for some more questions. So please feel free to ask those in the Q&A box if you have some more questions for us. We'll take a moment here and wait for another question.
Are there any comments?
All right, we've got another one up here. How do you celebrate and communicate lean wins outside of the immediate groups impacted?
Well, that is a great question. Because think about this, a small group of people are serving on the RPI team, but there's a whole rest of the staff who's really nervous about you and what you're doing and what you're going to do to change their work. So one of the steps is each day of a workshop, a flip chart is put up outside of the RPI team room, and the rest of the staff can see what was done or what experiments were performed. So there's ongoing communication, and that's what's important. The rest of the staff then are invited to a formal report out. So they get to hear everything and share. And one of the things that is really important about a lean concept is, we have to test ideas. There are hypotheses. We have to collect enough data. So it assures the rest of the staff that if there is an experiment and they will be part of it, it's not permanent. It's to assure that the idea is viable. Okay, so I hope that answers somewhat. Great question.
All right, folks, please share any other questions you may have. We still have a few minutes if you'd like to ask any.
I have a question for the group. Can I ask it?
Absolutely.
What's the challenge of taking lean manufacturing concepts into another organization? How do you think about that? And are any of these tools or concepts applicable to your organization?
All right, and we've asked folks to please answer that question in the chat.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Here, so I'll share some of the comments here. So we have some folks who've said it's very applicable, and then somebody else has said the culture, as you said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Someone else says, I just need some additional training. And then, oh, sorry, I'm losing the chat here. And then which book and training would you recommend to get started is a question someone has.
There's a book that I read that made sense to me to understand lean, and I'll have to look up the exact title, but the title is Everything I Learned About Lean, I Learned in the First Grade. So it's really good because it takes you into grade school, and the father visits the grade school, and he has examples about the lunch line and how they do parallel lines to speed up. And it's an excellent book. So I think the author is Marchinico. But again, it's everything I learned about lean, I learned in grade school, first grade. Where do you get training? There are plenty of places who are giving basic training. If you look, there's basic training that even in some of the professional organizations. And of course, I don't want to boast, but I think later on, when my second book is published, it will be helpful. But the other thing is you need to try out concepts. And so I've given you a take-home list to say, when you're back at your organization, why don't you just try to do this? Why don't you take count all your mistakes. See how many there are. Start to notice things. And of course, real training comes by doing. So that's what I have to offer on that. Anything else?
Thanks, Patty. We had a couple more comments, so I thought I would share those. And then if we get some more questions, I'll share those as well. So from your earlier question, we have they're very applicable. I run into the issue of people seeing this as value added that will change the way things work. And someone else listed another challenge as the idea of we've always done it this way. And then just one more comment. I think there's a perception of issue with lean, whether right or wrong, because of its origins in manufacturing, and that it'll treat everyone like cogs in a machine or workers on an assembly line. I've experienced some difficulty getting buy-in to embrace it in organizations that profess more servant leadership-oriented management styles.
Well, of course, the intent of this webinar was to show you it's possible. It's possible and it works. It is successful. It's just that people don't know about it. And it's cost effective. And I'll tell you, if we don't start, I think we need to think about lean to help our governments and our nonprofits. There was another comment about this won't work here. What was it before, Liza? This won't work.
Yeah, let me see. Oh, is it, I run into the issue of people seeing this as value added and that will change the way things work.
Okay, what does that mean? Value added and that will change the way things work. I don't, are you meaning that they will say that? Are you afraid of the change in the work? I think that's behind the question. And I think that's a very legitimate concern. As I said, people are afraid you're going to change their work and they don't want to change. And so they have to be communicated with, they have to be assured that there are experiments and pilot programs and nothing is done without fully communicating with the whole staff.
And it looks like we have another question here in the chat. Do you ever have a problem generationally, as in boomers and millennials, how they react to lean?
Oh, that's a great and timely question. And it's something I'm pondering a lot. So, when you're facilitating staff in an organization, they all have a commonality. They're all doing jobs and they're dedicated to the mission. So that's sort of the bottom line. And so because I am a member of that staff facilitating and I'm not an outsider, it's easier for me to communicate among all the different generations. So the question might be asked is, why do you even ask the question? What is different about the different generations as far as change, new ideas, accepting experience, studying, or I don't know, this population is, hit by COVID. The internet, I believe has really been a source of information for a lot of us, but I think at times we lose focus. So anyway, I am pondering that and it's really good, but I think the first thing is to become educated about the different generations and what they need and where they are.
All right, folks, do we have any more questions? You can post them in the chat or the Q&A box. I'm monitoring both right now. All right, well, if we don't have any further questions, then I'll just take a moment to wrap up here. Thank you all so much for coming out for our Lean Rapid Process Improvement webinar today. There was so much interest in this webinar that we are now planning to offer some follow-up lean professional training with Paddy. Please consider taking a moment to fill out a poll about future trainings, and Erica has shared a link in the chat, and let us know what you'd like to learn about. We're planning to host some sessions in June, so be sure to sign up for our interest list if you'd like to stay up to date about further training. And we'll share a link with that in the chat as well. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to see you again at a future event. Thanks, everyone.